Hello, my name is Michael Rowntree, and I'm the pastor at a church called Wellspring Church in North Fort Worth, technically North Richland Hills. And we are hosting a discussion where we are talking about issues of race, of policing, and of the gospel. And we have one central question that we're trying to answer today. It's this question: what will it take for all of us to achieve both justice and peace? Both justice and peace. Of course, this comes from the chant and many protests around the nation that have been going on for years now. No justice, no peace. And so it is our firm belief, all of us are believers in Jesus Christ. We are pastors or community leaders. We have two police chiefs among us and pastors and Christian leaders. All of us are believers. And it is our firm belief that because of what Jesus did for us on the cross and giving his life not only to reconcile man to God, but according to Ephesians chapter 2, to break down the wall of hostility to reconcile man to man, that if Jesus went to such an extent to bring about unity between every ethnicity, then how much more should we as believers in Christ be laying down our own lives day in and day out in this cause? Obviously, there's a lot of conflict in our country, and it's not just between whites and blacks. It is also with the police force, and we're hearing slogans like "defund the police," and what does that mean? And we should reallocate those resources here or there, and no, we shouldn't. And all of this debate. Well, in America right now, a lot of people are looking for a politician to solve the problem. A lot of people are looking for various ways of solving the problem. But it's our belief that God is looking to his church, and he is saying, how are you going to be a light into the darkness? How are you going to bring about justice and peace? And so all of us have agreed to come together to answer this question, to take one small step in that direction. And so that's the question. How can we find justice and peace? What can we do practically? We're going to have some candid conversation. We're going to get real with one another. We're also going to be respectful and loving toward one another as Christ is toward us. And so with that said, we're just going to work through some introductions. So as I said, my name is Michael Rowntree, and we'll just work this way to my right. Josh, why don't you just introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Joshua Lewis. I function with Michael in a theology podcast. We do some ministry together. We typically tackle theological conversations. So in this talk, I'm just here to help navigate the conversation as far as how we can, again, bring that justice and peace together. I'm the father of 3 children, and my wife's name is Josie, and we live actually in the Haltom City, Fort Worth area. So.
Okay. How long have you been married, Josh?
Been married for 7 years.
7 years. All right. The number of completion in the Bible.
No, it's still going.
Okay. That was a bad choice.
It's still going.
Yeah.
Not complete.
Okay.
Yeah. Still got many years ahead.
Keep it going, man.
Yeah.
All right. So.
I'm Will Ford, and I'm here in the Dallas area. I work at Christ for the Nations Institute, where I'm the chair of the Marketplace Leadership Major. But I've been known for the past 20 years for traveling around the country, teaching on prayer, unity, and revival. Married to De Havilland. We've been married for 9 years. We have 4 kids, and I'm excited about being with y'all today.
Hey, I'm Scott Silverii. I'm a retired chief of police out of South Louisiana. I retired at 50 years old, at the top of my game, when I felt like God called me out for a different purpose, and I turned in 2 weeks' notice, and people thought I was insane, but I knew that God had called me out for a bigger purpose, and we're starting to see the manifestation of that purpose. But in addition to my law enforcement career, I have a PhD in cultural anthropology, and my dissertation topic was on police culture. So I hope to be able to take my experience in the education and our Christian belief to the conversation. Married, we have a blended family. We have 7 kids combined. My wife, Leah, we've been married for 5 years. And we live in DeSoto in South Dallas.
Awesome. That's great.
Okay. Wonderful.
My name is Floyd Ellsworth, and my wife and I, Michelle, we've been married for 26 years. We have 4 children. We pastor a church called Oasis Community Worship Center in Haltom City.
Okay.
And we have been pastoring the church for 10 years now.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Jimmy Perdue. I'm the chief here at North Richland Hills. I've been here for 15 years. I've actually been in law enforcement for 38 years. So I started very young and I've been doing it a long time. Likewise, been married for 30 years. In fact, this next month is my 30th anniversary, so she's a very patient, kind woman that has put up with a lot over the years, has blessed me with 3 children and 2 grandkids. And so it is a great relationship and one that has grown over the years as we continue to develop both personally and professionally, as well as from a Christian standpoint. Full disclosure, I grew up, my dad was a preacher, Southern Baptist minister for almost 40 years, so I come into this, talking too long, that's an honest thing for me. And if I take my watch off, he's in serious trouble, because I'm going to get after it after that point. So I'm glad to be here. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.
My name is Patrick Winfield, and I am the campus pastor for the Potter's House of Fort Worth. I have been in ministry for over 25 years. I'm originally from Chicago, and so matriculating from being a youth pastor to being a church planter to now being a campus pastor in Fort Worth has been very interesting. In those years, I've managed to meet my wife.
Come on.
And as a result, has enriched my life. And so we've been married for 18 years. We have 3 sons. My oldest boy is 25. My middle boy is 16, just turned 16. And my baby boy is 14, no longer a baby anymore, but he will always be a baby in my sight. And so we have been in that. I am also bivocational. I am not just a pastor, but I have a foot in the educational realm, and I have been in education for over 23 years as both teacher in the classroom and as assistant principal and as principal, and ultimately maybe school board rep. I don't know. But
Wow.
that's been my life.
So you got your foot in the community there, don't you?
Yes, sir. Yes,
Okay. Well, Patrick, maybe we can just begin with you, because what I feel, and Josh is going to kind of sort of co-host this with me and be asking questions too, but my feeling is that so much of what's happening in America is we're shouting past each other and not listening. Yeah. And we've all read the Proverbs where it talks about how, a fool loves to share his opinion without understanding the other side. And so I want us to begin by understanding. And so I'd like to begin with the African American leaders amongst us. And so we just want to hear your perspective and how you're processing especially recent events, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, because nobody views these things in a vacuum. We have a story that comes behind it. So could you share with us a little bit of your story, your experience with racism, discrimination, and then how that might play into what you're seeing take place in America today?
I'm going to try to be as concise as possible, because we're talking about years of seeing a system that has been diametrically opposed to people of color. As a teacher, as a history teacher, one of the things that I have discovered is that when I was teaching history, history was being told through the lens of white people. And not necessarily through the lens of all people who contributed to the building of this country. The curriculum that we would receive was always based off of a white perspective. And so I've had to inculcate within teaching U.S. history and world history different thoughts, ideologies, and views that were more comprehensive of all people groups that contributed to the building of this country. That's been something that I've seen, systematically within the inculcating of educational principles and or of a love for this country. That's been an issue. I'll give you one example that really hit me very hard. I'm working on my doctorate in education and at DBU, and we did a trip to Washington D.C. This was when President Obama was still in office, and we had a conversation with Arnie Duncan and with the educational policymakers. And one of the things that we did was we were going to different houses. We went to Thomas Jefferson's house. And my dean would say, Patrick, you're not going down to see the slave quarters? Now, I don't think he understood
Sure.
that this is not something that I want to take a tour of.
Right.
In fact, it is something that angers me.
Yeah.
For them, it was educational. For me, it reminded me of a country that when the Constitution was created, did not consider me a full person.
That's right. Yeah.
And so it was very disheartening. The only reason why I went down there, honestly, was to disrupt the whole tour. Because as we're talking about the forefathers and talking about liberty and justice for all, I wanted to really lift up for them liberty and justice, not for all, but for white people. And as it goes quickly, the dean saw me after it was over, and I was taking a walk, and he said, "What did you think of it?" And I said, "It is your thought in thinking that I would enjoy something like that that bothers me." And with a tear coming down my eye, I told him, I said, "And that is my problem with this country. Because you look at my pain of my ancestors as something that is just historical and not understanding the psychological or sociological impacts and consequences that that thing had on us." So that's my interaction. I can go on and on, but I think that kind of encapsulates how I feel about when I see George Floyd, when I see the police officer doing that, when I see Ahmaud Arbery being gunned down by two white men in broad daylight, when I see Tatiana Jefferson being shot in her own home, when I see Botha being shot in his home, and I continue to see it, it reminds me of the systemic racism that's within the fabric of our country. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. Floyd, could you share maybe some of your own experience? It could be like he was sharing some of the systemic side. It could be on the personal side. Either way.
I would just say, first of all, this is the closest I've ever been to a chief of police without my heart racing, you know? Because the reality is that it is a different world when you're an African American. When a police officer comes up behind you, it is completely different. Not so much as that I fear for my life, but I just know that I have to really be on my A game. And that feeling of wanting to guard yourself or your family or your kids when you see police officers, you know, I have a great respect for police officers. I was a Boy Scout, I was an Eagle Scout, and my troop leader was a sheriff. He was a sheriff in the town. And so he really instilled in us a love for our country, but a love for those in authority. And so he was like a real father figure to me. And so I developed a love for officers and those in authority. But as I got older, I realized that I wasn't seen in their eyes all the time the way that I saw them. And just because I, you know, was driving through a particular neighborhood, like my wife and I we were in a area, and I told her, I said, okay, I'm going to slow down. I'm going to put my cruise on because I know that there's a good chance that we could be stopped. And sure enough, we were. And so your heart is pounding and racing, and you look around, you say, you know, why is this? Simply because of the color of my skin. As a believer, you got to work through all of that.
Yes.
See, that's the thing. And then as a pastor, I have to even work through that even more, you know. But there is a reality that I think sometimes we don't want to talk about, and we need to talk about it because there are people that don't want to fear. I love being able to sit beside this man. Here's the chief too, you know, not have that fearful thing. But I want us to get there where what I feel right now, that people of color can feel that as well, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Floyd. Okay.
Yeah, for me, I'll talk about mine from the talk. Did y'all get the talk?
Yeah.
All right. So the whole thing happened with Trayvon Martin. We found out that all of us were getting the talk.
Yeah.
And the talk basically is that conversation that your parents, your father in particular, would have with you and say, this is how you interact with the police, and this is how you make sure that, that you come home safe.
Yes.
The talk actually started for me at 6 years old. Mm-hmm. My dad had a business here in Fort Worth, Texas, Ford Universal Carpet Company. It's not around, but shameless plug anyway. But, love that place. But my dad put me to work at 6. He got me a Social Security card. And he made me at 6 years old memorize my Social Security number. I didn't know why. Then 10 years later, I get my driver's license number. Get my driver's license, I get the card, but he made me, forced me to memorize my driver's license number and my Social Security number, make sure I memorize both. I said, why are you so obsessed with numbers? He said, okay, here's the deal. Let me go ahead and talk to you right now about this. See, I have friends who are police officers. He said, but even them, some of them will tell you that there are people who have badges who hide their insecurities behind a badge. Mm-hmm. And sometimes these guys will take your wallet from you, and if you don't know your information, they'll just take you in on suspicion. And they say, oh yeah, and don't take the bait. So what do you mean? He said, well, sometimes they'll try to say provocative things to you to try to provoke you into retaliating or something like that. He said, your job is to come home. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Your job is to come home. You say yes, sir. Mm-hmm. You say no, sir. If you need to look at a badge number, do that. But your job is to come home. End of story. You got that? Like, yes, sir. Well, 3 years later, I'm playing junior college basketball. I'm in Midland, Texas. And myself and 2 other teammates were walking into a grocery store, and my teammate says, this guy following us, he's a narc. I said, what do you mean a narc? He's an undercover cop. I said, he looks like a normal guy. He said, nah, I watch. And so we walked around, and of course he was following us. My teammate got so mad. We get to the checkout line, and my teammate started shouting, yes, I'm reaching into my pocket right now to grab my wallet, and I'm about to pay with the money my mother sent me. I'm saying this because this man back here, he is an undercover cop. He follows me every time I come in here, and I'm sick of it. And I'm like, like shrinking, right?
Wow.
And he's acting like, what are you talking about, right? And so he follows us out, the 3 of us out, and he shows us his badge. He said, you know what, I am an undercover police officer, but that was totally uncalled for. And my teammate is like screaming at the top of his lungs still. I'm nervous, and then the police officer breaks being professional, and they started going back and forth at each other. They actually started cussing back and forth at each other. Mm-hmm. I'm like, oh no, what in the world? At this time, my other teammate leans over to me and says, hey, Floyd, you got to be down for whatever happens here. So I'm like, oh my God, I got these two guys screaming at each other. I got this other guy whispering in my ear. And then at that point, that police officer stopped talking just to my teammate, and he looked at all 3 of us one at a time and said, so what you gonna do about it, boy? Mm-hmm. What you gonna do about it, boy? But then when he said it to me, I heard my father say, don't take the bait. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I said, come on, y'all, let's go. Just broken record technique. Come on, y'all, let's go. Come on, y'all, let's go. And we left, we cried. Yeah. We never talked about it again. Wow. And that's what I kind of feel is happening in our nation right now. Everybody's taking the bait in some shape, form, or fashion. So when I see what happened with Ahmaud Arbery, when I see what happened with, especially with George Floyd, those experiences, I have others I could talk about. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, because of my dad's, I never spent time in a jail cell. But I've had a couple of confrontations like that where, just driving while black, like Floyd was talking about, and getting pulled over. But I hadn't taken the bait. But seeing what happened with George Floyd, those things come back to the forefront, and you see it informs what's happening in a way that's pretty powerful. And so that's been my experience. Thankfully, like Floyd said, as a believer, as a leader, as a Christian, and especially I've been working on this whole thing of reconciliation. I'll talk about that maybe a little bit more, but I want to share just a little bit what informs what I see is painful, and you feel it, and you go through the whole thing. That could have been me. This could have been me. Yeah. Right. So.
I'd like to I know you guys personally, so I know many of your stories. Pastor Floyd, could I, if you're comfortable sharing with it, let me know. If not, the story of the beach when you and some of your friends from the Boy Scouts went to go hang out at their dad's house. I think that story, because you're just one generation away from me, you know, that story I think paints such a painful picture, and I think that misery loves company. And I think we're able to suffer with you through this story. Sure. I think it would maybe de-escalate any kind of further accusations for people who might be listening and thinking, well, we've got to be right, we've got to be right. Like, we need to suffer well, right? We need to suffer together before we can, I think, maybe move too far down this rabbit trail.
Sure. This happened in the actually the early '80s, and I made reference that I was a Eagle Scout, and so me and my friends, we served as camp counselors for the Boy Scout camp. And my friends, there were actually were two white guys and one Asian guy, and then myself. And my white friend, he said, you know, since we're at camp, it's going to take a while to go, all the way back home. We only had one day. Why don't you guys come to our lake house? My dad has a private lake house, and then you guys just come over and just stay with me that one night at the lake house. And we were like, yeah, we'll do that. And so we went to his lake house and taking a break from the camp. We had 1 day break, and got our bags, went into the house, and it wasn't 5 minutes later that this guy came with his truck and 4 huge dogs. And he got out of the truck. He's holding the dogs, all 4 of them, and he knocked on the door, opened the door, and he looked right at me, and he said, "Who brought this?" and used the word N-word on this property. And my friends were like, "Well, he's our guest. My father owns this lake house." He was like, "This is a private beach, and we're not going to have that N-word. I don't even like using it. With our people here, so he's got to go." And they were like, "Well, this is my dad's place." And he's like, "I don't care. You have 5 minutes to get him out of here." And he said, "I'm going to leave and I'm going to come back. When I come back, if he's not gone, there's going to be trouble." Wow. And so he left, and what struck me was my friends were visually shaken. Yeah. And they were crying. They were more upset, honestly, than I was, because I had been through stuff like this. I've seen it before, but this was the first for them. They were shocked. Here's the 80s and this is happening. And so they were like, "No, Floyd, we just need to stay here, man, and we'll confront this thing." And I'm like, "That's either for y'all to say." Yeah. No, he said, "Those dogs are from me." No. We're out of here. And so sure enough, he came back. He came back with several other guys in trucks. Wow. And they came out. And his thing is, "This is a private beach. We will not have your kind here on this beach." And he used the word boy. If I said anything, I was like, "I'm not talking to you, boy." And and so we got in the car, and they followed us all the way back to our camp. Oh my gosh. All the way back to our camp. And my friends were just so shaken, and they were just weeping. Interesting enough, I shared this the other day. One of my friends, the other white friend who was with me, he called his parents and told them about what had happened, and he said, "I want you to meet Floyd, and can he come, and spend a couple of nights at our house?" And he was shocked by what his mother said. His mom said to him, "He can come. This is 1982, 83. He can come, but have him come through the back door. And he has to come at night." And my friend was like, "Mom, what, are you being serious?" He's like, "Well, what would the neighbors think?" is what she said. He had just witnessed this racism, with me at the beach. And now he calls home, had no idea. And she said, "I'm not prejudiced." But for the neighbors,
Yeah.
for the neighbors, it wouldn't look right if he came through the front door. I thought, this is 1983. What is this? And so these are the experiences that we live with. And again, you read the word and you know what the word says, and you try to walk through these things in love and grace. And Jesus says, bless those who persecute you and bless and curse not. And so you take that the kingdom aspect of it, and that's how you try to view it. But it doesn't mean that the pain is not there.
Right.
That you still have to deal with the pain of that. And it's so funny. My mom, I didn't tell my parents this story. She just heard it the other day when I shared it.
Wow.
She just heard it for the first time the other day. You know what my mom said to me? I called her on the phone, I was talking to her, and she said, you know, son, I watched an interview you did and you shared that story. And she said, I couldn't sleep all night. I said, why couldn't you sleep? She said, all I could think of, I want to find a guy in the truck.
Wow.
Like, Mom, that's just been like 30-some years later. But still, to a mom, that
Yeah.
pain is like,
Yeah.
no,
That's right.
I want to find a guy in the truck who treated my son that way. These experiences are real.
Very.
And you said earlier, I do believe in my heart of hearts that the church is the answer. We have to be the answer, or we're in trouble.
Yes.
Yeah.
If we don't have an answer to this coming from the church, we are in trouble.
Okay, now with the three of you, I'm kind of curious about this, what your experience has been in interacting with white individuals. Have they believed your narrative? Have they not believed? Because here's what I've found in interacting with folks. If I share a statistic about racism and systemic racism, there's a different statistic that they have.
Right.
If I share a story, it's, well, that's one person, it's a one-off, that's not common. And I'm curious, have you guys had that same experience? Do you feel like the white community has heard you? Or do you feel like when you share these things, they don't really hear you?
Well, I feel like there are some that will, and some who are probably now more than ever more open to hearing. Because you can't argue with what you see. At the end of the day, statistics, data goes out the door when you see it real time. And I think for us, we have been saying, yeah, I understand your statistics, and numbers can lie. If you just do not report all of the numbers.
Right, it's not like Will's story or
Right,
Floyd's story
exactly.
fitted to somebody's
Exactly.
statistic.
It can be skewed to whatever you would like to see. And so those conversations are able to be had. One of the things that I've always said is that I know the church has talked about racial reconciliation, but we can't have racial reconciliation without racial recognition. You've got to know me. You've got to see me
Yeah.
to be reconciled with me.
Yeah.
Jesus must need go through Samaria.
Yeah.
He had to see her, recognize her, be in the midst of her culture before he dealt with the pain that she was feeling. So we're all at the place in which I think now more than ever people are starting to hear and to open up, but you will always have people who don't want to hear, and that's a part of the narrative too.
Yeah.
My thing is I just give up. There is a gentleman that we were having this conversation, and he was bringing me back stats and data, and no, there was something wrong with George Floyd. You know, he was a crook.
Jesus.
Yeah, you know, Ahmaud Arbery was trespassing, and that's, I mean, the narrative. But I want you to think about this, and I told him, I said, I want you to think about what you're saying. In order for slavery to happen, in order for people to feel comfortable with that ethic, you would have to demean and to diminish the humanity of a whole people.
That's right.
And you would have to say that they were 3/5 of a person in order for you to feel good about doing it. And we are still in the same psychological modality that says, in order for me to feel good about treating black people like this, I've got to look at their past record to see what nefarious behaviors that they have been a part of. And if not, make something up so that the public can now embrace the activity or the behavior. This is systemic. And so, yes, you'll always have that pushback, but now more than ever, there are white people, pastors, leaders who are open to the conversation, and it is refreshing.
Amen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
I would say for me, it's a little bit different in that Josh made reference to this. You know, most of the time when someone see me and they know that I'm a pastor, or I tell them I'm a pastor, or I invite someone to my church, they automatically assume it's a black church. And
Automatically.
and that's, however, I would say that's the church's
You don't
fault.
correct him either.
Yeah, that's the church's fault. I think that's a whole nother subject
Yes, it
of why that is that assumption.
Very true.
In but the Oasis, we are coming up on 10 years, and it really is a predominantly white church. It has been from the very beginning, with many different races. And you said how people hearing you. I get more comments from my white brothers and sisters showing empathy and tears. I mean, like real tears. When I share these stories, it pains them.
Yeah.
Just like my friends. I mean, my friends who were in the car with me, they wept. So for me to say what that one man did, you know, and then went back and got his others with the dogs, that I will put this on the brothers who were with me. No, it wasn't the same. So I didn't blame all white people. And those in my church have wanted to hear these stories, and every time I do tell them, it touches them.
Yeah.
You know, like for real. It's not even like, you know, oh, I just really feel sorry for you. I see the tears. I get the letters. I get the emails. I know they're being real. And so I'm actually hopeful because the conversations are starting to happen now. And I think people's hearts who may have been turned off with this subject, it's coming up to the table now. So tell me more. I really want to hear this because I've kind of shied away from it. But I need to hear this. I need to feel your pain. You know, we were talking earlier, you know, about the justice and the peace. And I think what's important is that until we see that we're all made in the image of God and we recognize that, that we can't have peace. I mean, there can't be justice. What happened to George Floyd was the fact that the officer did not see that the man whose knee he had on his neck, that man was made in the image of God. That's right. When you understand that the person is made in the image of God, I don't care what he's done. It doesn't matter. He has value.
That's right.
Value comes from the fact that he's made in the image of God. Amen. And if we can start there, whether you're white, black, green, purple, if you were made by God, then I see that there is value in you. And who am I to devalue you
That's right.
in any way?
Right.
And I think we have to go there. But I have been really encouraged over the last couple of weeks from my white brothers and sisters who have contacted me sincerely and said, man, I'm glad we're now having this conversation. I am so sorry. I got one just the other day. Again, I am so sorry for the pain that you've gone through. What can I do to help bring more healing? So.
Yeah, I guess for me, you know, being on the platform and kind of being known for dealing with racial reconciliation, just short story, like minute and a half. In my family, I have a 200-year-old kettle pot that was used by the slaves in my family. They used it for cooking, but they secretly used it for prayer. They were owned by a slave master who would beat them for any reason, and praying was one of them. So they would sneak into a barn at night to pray anyway. And take that pot, turn it upside down, prop it up with rocks, prostrate themselves on the ground, put their lips in between the opening between the ground and the kettle, so that kettle pot muffled their voices as they prayed through the night. Oh, wow. And the story they passed down with the pot is that they didn't think they would see freedom in their time, so they prayed for the freedom of their children in the next generation. So I've been taking that pot around the country to talk about the prayer bowls in heaven. Revelation 5 and 8, the bowls in heaven full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints, and talking about how it just wasn't black Christian slaves, but also white Christian abolitionists. Those folks prayed into being the first and the second great awakening. Had it not been for those revivals, slavery wouldn't have ended. Then I had this dream about Dr. King where God dealt with me about my unforgiveness issues with the white community. My friend asked me to share it at the Lincoln Memorial, and we had a prayer meeting. There was a white guy who had a dream about the guy over the event. Never met him before. He comes to that event, white guy. We became friends. We've been friends for 16 years. Well, fast forward, that friend of mine found out that the Civil War ended in his family's front yard. Wow. So we thought, cool coincidence. I got this kettle pot with Slaves Pray for Freedom. You have this house where the General Lee had his last battle in your family's front yard. We thought, cool coincidence. But then we stumbled on more research, and we learned that it was his family who owned my family where that kettle pot came from.
Oh, come on.
And we met at the Lincoln Memorial, both led by dreams, to the place where Dr. King said, I have a dream that one day the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners could sit together at the table of
My
brotherhood.
goodness.
Bring it.
So that's
That's
so-
the wrap-up
so that's
story.
the-
Sharing it too
no,
early.
but-
You're sharing it too early.
Let's say that's the conclusion,
okay,
man.
everybody. It's not getting better than that.
Wow. We're all preachers and pastors, so we know like this, like that's a powerful story. We've been sharing that story around the country. So I say all that to say this, because we're leaders. I'm talking to leaders in this. So there was an event that my friend and I, we've been sharing this around the country. We wrote a book together called The Dream King, shameless plug. But anyway, we were going to speak at this huge event, and it switched leaders in terms of who's going to take over the event. And those folks came back to us and said, just healing the racial divide is kind of a distraction, and we don't want to focus on that day. We just want to focus on, the harvest. So, great story. I mean, it's a God story, but we're gonna just, that's a distraction. That's what I've been seeing up to this moment, and in between our flashpoints. Healing the racial divide has been a distraction. But here's what's happened to that distraction. We have been walking, like talking about the priests, the prayer folks, the Levites, the worship folks. We've been, prayer, worship, movements, whatever, have been walking right by healing the racial divide, like the Good Samaritan story. And here's how it's felt like, and this is one of these kids, they emailed me and they said, what this feels like is like, we're the ones who need healing in this area, and the prayer and the worship movements and other things are going straight by, but at least in that story, they were on their way to the church house. These folks are on their way to the ballot box, and they could care less about us. And they don't understand we have pain. We want to deal with this, and it's just being dismissed right now. And so I get emails from young folks. They tell me, man, this conference, it's like 18 speakers and it's lily white, or this conference, it's 18 speakers and it's just nothing but black people. We talk more about diversity on my job than we do in the church.
Come on.
When is the church going to catch up? So the younger generation is looking at all this stuff that's going on right now, and they're like, if y'all not going to address this, we are. All right? And that's across the board. This younger generation, they see this stuff and they're frustrated. So that's what I say all that with that story to say, still, because of what I'm known for with that story and carrying that kettle, there are places I still don't get to speak because they don't want to deal with the distraction of healing the racial divide.
I'd be interested in hearing from our police officers and former police officers on just the kind of, again, context. You've seen some of the videos that we've seen. You've seen the injustices in different areas. Speak in with your context of how you guys are processing that. I'd love to maybe hear, Scott, from you first of the police culture and talk about that. Some people don't understand that a police culture is within itself its own ecosystem in a sense, and how we can kind of understand that.
Sure. Well, and it's true. And first off, I believe amongst the culture of law enforcement, there's universal condemnation of what happened.
Yeah.
You would have to be just a hard-hearted outlier to start talking about statistics, right? Well, the policy allows for this, blah, blah, blah. I've heard about excited delirium and all these other excuses why they kept his knee on the back. But it comes down to just, like you said, there was a devaluation that is a person beneath your knee.
Yeah.
So law enforcement in general, and we're talking broad brushstrokes generalizations, there is a universal condemnation about what happened, that it was wrong. The culture, and I think we joked about it when I first got here, was, there's such a strong code of silence. And It wasn't until I retired, and actually, you know, like I said, I was still a chief of police. I just received another 4-year contract. I've been offered the job in a big city, and I turned it down. I didn't realize God was calling me out. And I didn't realize the reason he was calling me out was to free me from that code of silence, from that culture. I had seen that. And when I say, you know, the culture and the code of silence, and I don't mean it's racist. It's assimilation into a culture.
Right.
Like all groups, clubs, everything like that, right? There's an assimilation process. And in that assimilation becomes almost a hardening of hearts. And which is really, I mean, the law enforcement community is so dysfunctional. The divorce rates, the suicide rates, the addiction, the alcoholism and everything. But it's because of that hardening of the heart, because becoming part of the fraternity requires you to disengage from the community. And you know, and you spend more time in training academies and, you know, learning to enforce the law and learning to police survival and take other people's lives than you do dealing with sociological issues and psychological issues. So it's an issue of the training, but to be a part of that culture, you have to assimilate. And to be part of that culture and keep your card in check means keeping your mouth shut. So, you know, I was joking with someone I got here. I was like, they're like, man, it must be hard to talk about. I'm like, it's not anymore.
Yeah.
When I retired, it's not at all. And you know, I was led to do my doctoral study in police culture. And the name of the book, with the publisher, is Cop Culture and Why Good Cops Go Bad. And of course, when we say bad, we're not, you know, we're talking the whole gamut of what you may identify as bad. But I really do, the general sense that we get from the ministerial side in the law enforcement is that there's a gap of understanding, like, what do we do? Like, we want to bridge the gap. I'm saying we as in the collective body of law enforcement, we want to bridge that gap, but what do we do? You know, and then for cops that are still on the job, it's you know, well, you know, I've seen the chiefs that have laid down, that have prostrated themselves in protest, and those that have kneeled. And then, man, some of the cops are like, how dare you kneel? And then the others who refuse to kneel. And the other side's being, well, why don't you show compassion? And so it is such a gulf of a gap of understanding of what to do. As a fraternity, I believe they want to do better, but they just don't know how to do better.
So that's outside looking in from being in, then coming outside. Chief Perdue, Jimmy, tell us how are you navigating that right now? I mean, I'm sure every other police officer under your command is like, I don't know what to do, and the ones that do think they know what to do, I'm sure you think they're wrong. So how do you navigate through this kind of space?
It is difficult, I will tell you, and I believe Scott is right. Most well-meaning, well-intended officers want to do the right thing. They truly, truly do. Are there bad cops? Are there evil cops? There absolutely are. And it is my job, and every chief around and every police officer around, to ferret them out and get them out and remove them from what's going on. Because, and again, I always say, I go back to everybody else's personal story. When I rededicated my life to Christ when I was 13, my dad was a pastor, as mentioned. I felt called to the ministry. I assumed at that time that it was going to be a preacher, because that's what my dad did, my brother did, so that's what I did. I didn't realize it till later on, is that this is my ministry. Being a police officer and being in a position of leadership to help guide the future of an agency, the future of an entity, and to help shape young men and women who want to serve their communities is what I believe God has put me here to do. And so I have spent my entire career trying to bridge those gaps and fill those voids that are happening. You know, I come to it with my own, the common phrase now, my own implicit bias. You know, I grew up in West Texas. My best friend in junior high was a black guy that he and I played football together, did all the stuff, did everything together, but I never got to go to his house. And I never knew why. It was just kind of the rules are you didn't go over the tracks. That's where you lived. And so I didn't go over there. I never questioned why. It was just the way it was. And it wasn't until later in life that I realized that it was this systemic culture that is just, you just don't mix. He doesn't come to our house. My dad's the pastor of the First Baptist Church. You don't do that. That's not what you allowed. And so it wasn't until later, and then as you go to church and you realize, to go back to Pastor Floyd's comment, that the most divided time in America is Sunday mornings. That is when we all go to our black churches, our white churches, and everything else, and that drives me crazy. And I when my church started having more people come into it, one I go to now, there were some that didn't like it and left. I've considered that to be a true blessing because I got to learn more, because I am I'm a lifelong learner. I want to make sure that I'm bringing in all those cultures and all those things. And so as they apply to law enforcement, I believe that it is my role, and I have spent the majority of my life trying to help officers understand those feelings that you have. As I listen to you talk, and I listen to we had our own Black Lives Matter march last week. As I sat and listened to them talk, I got tearful, and not because of what they were saying, but because it pains me how much distrust there still is, despite almost 40 years of being a cop, trying to do the best I can for my community. It is painful to me that we still are having this conversation. It is painful to me to watch Mr. Floyd die the way he did, and watch that animal do what he did to him. There is no justification. I don't care what he did. Anything before that. That moment was just a moment of evil that man did to him. And so I recognize, would I love to not be, as a profession, blamed and as a whole? Yes, but that kind of goes with it. When pastors go bad, all pastors are kind of looked at. That's just the way it is,
We own it, yeah.
And the same thing. But I also believe that law enforcement holds a special place in American culture and in American society. We're the only ones vested with the authority to take somebody's life and liberty by law. We can do that. That is a heavy, heavy burden that should only be done, should only be exercised with absolute, complete due process, complete understanding of why the person's there, and as an absolute last resort. And that is the message that I continue to preach to my agency, to anybody that's around me, to everything else, to try to say we've got to treat everyone equally. We've got to make sure that they're all given their due process. We've got to make sure that we understand where they come from, listen to people. As that's I keep hearing over and over again. The thing that we have done a horrible job is just listening to each other, listening to the stories, listening to, it just breaks my heart to hear that people were that way, because that's just not the way I was brought up. Yeah. There are parts of my life that I understand there was some implicit racial bias in there that I've had to take out of my system, and to try to, in my own children, and that's the one blessing I have. When my kids, I'll be short. When my kids went to elementary school, the elementary school they went to spoke 61 languages in that elementary school. Wow. They looked at everybody equally. They didn't know any different. Anybody. My son's best friend was from Iceland. Go figure. But they all were just friends. They all came over to our house. We didn't care. It was all just one. And I want to have that view of people as an adult the same way that kids look at each other. They don't look at each other colors or whatever. They look at each other as just a person.
That's great.
And so that's the message that I hope that we can convey to law enforcement. Some of me, I'm 38 years into my police career. It's certainly on the more of the end than the beginning. In some ways, I regret that, because this is a pivotal moment in the relationship between law enforcement and all the minority communities, Black community, Hispanic, whatever. And I want to be in that fight. I want to be there to help make this better, because I believe in what we're doing as a profession, but I believe in what people are trying to get out of their and want from their law enforcement. We're here to serve. We're servants, and that's what we should be doing. So.
Okay, and I'd like to ask a follow-up question to both police chiefs, chief and former chief, retired chief, really on the nature of what is the problem, because I've heard you both identify, that was deplorable. What we've been seeing on cell phone videos is terrible, and nobody in law enforcement would stand up for that, or very few people. And so I've seen terms such as, okay, there are some bad apples, which is true. You mentioned in the pastoral profession, my profession too. There are some bad apples. Okay, so that's one part of it. I've heard reference to police culture, and you talked about that a little bit, Scott, and I know that you wrote a dissertation on it and have a PhD in that area. So how much of this is a few bad apples, which we really can't avoid? There's going to be sometimes a bad apple in every profession. How much of this is cultural? Maybe a culture of being overly aggressive, maybe a culture of, could it even be targeting minority communities or just minorities generally? Is it built into the police culture, or how much of it is mental health? Because there's so much, you know, I
really good.
you know, have been a chaplain before within our HPD, and so I know just the weightiness of like day in and day out. You were dealing with some pretty bad stuff, and it weighs on you. And so, how can we identify which of these it is, or is it a confluence? Maybe Scott, start with you, and then Jimmy.
Sure. Well, I believe it starts talking from the culture side. It starts day one in the academy. We're fed media, movie myths, what we think police are. We have maybe this idealistic notion of helping people, or this exciting notion of the gunfights and chases, and we bring that anticipation. We walk into the academy on day one, and we understand right off the bat that is not it. Like, you can only know what you've ever known, and if you've never been to a police academy, you've never been a police officer, you have no idea what the job entails, what the culture involves. So it begins that breaking down process, and it separates what you thought it was going to be and to what they're trying to instill and what it actually is. One of the things that I identified in my studies was that us versus them culture. And that doesn't, they say, the thin blue line, it's us between the bad guys, we're standing between the good citizens and the bad guys. But actually the us versus them mentality begins in the academy when you're forming these new ideas of what your job's going to be and who you're supposed to be to keep that job. And one of the things that I really grieved, and I was a victim of in the beginning, was I lost who I was. I was a believer going in, and the job identified me for a period of time, until I stood back up, and re-identified who I was in the job. But in that academy, homogeneity is very important. We've all got to look alike, walk alike, talk alike, and it doesn't matter what race you are. We say we're blue, but the reality is when we understand our race even under the badge. But in the academy, you start to develop that us versus them. It's the cadets versus the drill instructor. If my gig line's off in my uniform, we're all doing push-ups, so we learn to cover for each other. When you graduate the academy and you're assigned to your FTO, usually the first thing you're told is forget what they taught you in the academy. This is where you learn to be a cop. Who's telling you that? It's these old salty cops that want you to now fall in. They don't want you to make any waves, right? So homogeneity always runs through the course of the cultural expectation.
Wow.
Everybody's got to play the game, you see. And if you want to fit in, you're going to be ostracized. And the quickest way to get rid of law enforcement officers is to segregate them. You don't fit in. You don't belong. I don't talk to you in the locker room anymore. And that's how you weed them out. I've found in my studies is that, the high demographic of law enforcement officers are white males. At one time it was 70%, high school educated, maybe some college, low to middle socioeconomic backgrounds. And we all have that deep desire to belong, some type of fraternal belonging. And so when you take that desire to belong to something bigger than yourself, even if it's an idealistic notion to serve the public, and all of a sudden you're like, well, if you don't act like the rest of us, then you don't belong. And then that's very powerful. It's powerful for everyone,
yes,
but mostly, very particularly in law enforcement. So when you have that officer kneeling on, and the other three, because it's like, well, why don't they do something?
That's why I thought it was culture. It's part of the culture.
And it's to intervene would be to break that code. Would be to break that. I mean, let's go back to Rodney King. I mean, when you, it's like, I was just starting law, and I'm like, why don't they do something? Because you're prevented from the cultural expectation. Wow. To intervene is to break the code, is to break that pattern of homogeneity. And I expect probably like you, and I don't want to speak for you, but when you take that stand, you kind of stand in the gap. You kind of stand on the fringe of law enforcement's culture. It's easy to go with the flow and be one of the guys. It's another thing to stand up and say, I'm a Christian, I don't stand for that, we want better. Is it impossible? No. And one of the things, we're talking about the academy, is one of the problems I see is that there's no national standardization. And that's one of the things a lot of people don't understand. When you say there's going to be sweeping law enforcement reform, people don't understand that there's over 900,000 commissioned law enforcement officers. There's millions of retired, separated, there's millions that have been through the indoctrination process. But then of those 900,000, you have over 9,800 independent agencies. So you may have the campus police at DBU. The FBI director can't say, hey, don't do that anymore. They are autonomous, independent, most of them are political subdivisions. So your cities, your sheriffs, your states, your federal agencies, to say that there's going to be sweeping change without some kind of national mandate, it's not going to happen.
Right.
It's not automatically going to happen.
That's right.
And I think that's a misconception with the conversation that's going on right now. With everybody's expecting the federal government to come in and say all these things are going to be, and the reality is that's not the way this country is framed. That's not the law enforcement in this country. We're based on those states' rights individually, even down to the local right. And so again, they can do what they want to, but my city manager, me as the police chief, get to dictate what we do at my department. That's part of the problem.
Yeah. And that fragmentation is just, it makes change not impossible, but difficult.
Very difficult. And even so, because my answer was going to be to your question was the legal, it depends. It depends on what part of the country you're from. Policing in the Northeast, policing in the South, policing in the West are vastly different. I've had the opportunity to travel around the country and teach at different departments and go to different places. And the things that, when I go to classes and I'll sit there and people from, a big city up north in Illinois described, they'd say, we do this so-and-so, and I would say, you can't do that. You can't do that. And they're like, we do that all the time. And that is just the culture of that individual. And so it's a police culture, you're right. But then there's also individual, regional, departmental culture. I just sent an email to somebody, and you've all heard it before, is that culture eats policy for breakfast.
Yes.
You can have all the policies you want. You can have the best policies in the world, in fact. But if you don't have a culture of inclusion and making sure that everybody's treated the same, it doesn't matter what your policy says. And so, I started in 1982 in law enforcement. The community policing movement really, 81 is really kind of the starting point of that. And so my entire career has been through this journey, through us converting from an old school, more dictatorial, autocratic policing to this one of community policing. And to me, it's the way you're supposed to do it. But again, I come into it with a Christian heart and a Christian background of service, of treating everybody the same and equally, and protecting the community. That's my background coming into it. And it has been a struggle along the way of people who did not feel that everyone should deserve the same treatment regardless of who they are. So I think it is, I absolutely believe that the conversation that's going on right now is important, and it is needed, and it is necessary to move us forward. But everybody needs to understand is that this is a long, for all the time it took us to get to this point, it's going to take us more time to go forward. But we'll never do it if we don't have these conversations now. And so I am glad and grateful that we're having these conversations, that we are being held accountable. I have no problem as a police chief or as a police officer being held accountable for my actions or the actions of my officers. None whatsoever. I just want to make sure that we do so in the context of don't hold me accountable for the actions of the officers in fill in the blank. I can only control the things that I can control in the area that I have authority to control. And within that, we need to, and again, this all starts back to the local church, local departments, all getting together, making sure we're communicating what we can do here. And if everybody does that all across the country, then we'll be a lot further advanced along. So
That's so good.
I'd be interested. I know we've talked about police. We've asked some of our African American leaders here present. What is the white church as far as you're pastoring a predominantly white church in a predominantly white neighborhood? It's not to any fault of your own, but how are you navigating this conversation? Because we get, I think at the top of the program you had mentioned that anytime that you say, hey, Black Lives Matter, the response is, well, all lives matter. And you get a statistic out there, they've got 3 statistics that they're shooting back. How do you try to create the empathy that is necessary to see change and reform?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I'll say that our individual local church, Wellspring Church, is really great. And I've been, as you mentioned, we are predominantly white. We are also in a predominantly white area. it has been on my heart to create a more multi-ethnic community, because I believe that that is a profound witness to the world that, like, hey, when nobody else can get this right, what if the church could get this right?
Yeah.
And I look at the Apostle Paul, and instead of saying, hey, let's do a Gentile church over here and a Jewish church over here because you guys are too culturally different, you know, Gentiles like Gentile music, and Jews, you're jamming out to some different, you know, it's like, no, let's pull them together. And then, like, you know, Book of Romans, and if he, like, he's talking through how do we work through the cultural differences. And so for Paul, the battle was worth it, because there is skin color, but then there is a cultural difference between white and black communities too. And Paul says this is worth it because what Christ did was worth it. And Jesus' final prayer, when we are one, that's how the world's going to know that I'm the Son of God. And so despite that, I haven't made just like massive progress in becoming more multi-ethnic yet. You know, we'll see what's in the Lord's heart there, but my congregation is used to me talking about it.
Yeah.
And I will say that as a white pastor, and really to anyone viewing white people generally, this is, I think, just a conversation we have to get used to having. Because, Will, you talked about, you know, we have the conversation. You know, like, white people didn't have to grow up saying, like, the talk. White people didn't have to grow up saying, hey, because you're white, ...
Right.
You know.
You never had the talk?
Yeah. No, they didn't have the talk. So, I mean, I
My
have.
friends were always telling me I wasn't going to be able to play
Yeah.
basketball.
But
Really talk on
actually,
God.
as a dad, though, I've had a different talk, and I have talked to my kids about race. And I've talked to them about inequalities, because I want them to grow up being aware of that.
Right.
And I love that Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan is an interracial parable. Like it's a Jew to Gentile thing, or Jew to Samaritan thing, and it's like, what does loving my neighbor look like? It means crossing the road, going out of my way to build relationship and serve and love and help those who are oppressed. And so my church has heard me talking about this for a long time. And so I think for white people, that's just a big part. I think white people are scared to talk about race. I'll be honest.
For certain.
And even right now, as this is happening, and so I'll maybe kind of put this out to some of our African American leaders. You know, I see African Americans on, say, Twitter or on Facebook saying, you know, now you're all interested in race. Where were you, you know, the last 10 years? I see them saying things like, you know, you said this the wrong way and you should have said this. And the white people are like, I'm so sorry, you know. And so white people are afraid.
Leo
because,
Giglio was doing his best
Well,
job. He was trying. He was trying.
Blessings.
yeah,
Probably,
so,
we can skip past that.
Yeah, let's
go ahead and cut
skip
that
past
out. Yes, sir. Get back in.
But so, you know, I do think as a community of grace, I want us to have grace for each other. I expect Twitter to have zero grace, right? Like, let's expect that. But in the church, let's have grace for talking about a hard conversation. And I think for the average white person, we have not overtly talked about it for a long time. And we have found a clip of Morgan Freeman from 10 years ago saying, if you just don't talk about race, there's no problem. We are awesome at finding the one person who agrees with us
Confirmation
and
bias.
sharing that, right?
Right.
Yeah. And which, by the way, like, what problems does that work with? Ignore the problem; it goes away. Right. So
Marriage.
it does not work in marriage, does it? No. So anyway, so I would just say for white people, talking about it and beginning to be comfortable talking about it, and honestly, I'm not going to really. I don't really feel comfortable advising to African Americans how to respond, except I would just say to the broad Church of God, let's all have grace talking about it. And the reason I say I feel as though I want to say this, like, whenever you guys were each sharing your story, kind of like we read in the Psalms, and it will say Selah, like pause and think calmly. That, like, I just wanted to stop for like 30 minutes and have a moment of lament. You know, like, I just wanted to pray and to soak in that. And we can't do that because we got video cameras rolling. We got, like, conversation to have. But, like, my point is, like, I feel like the most important thing, like, I want to elevate your voices. I want, because it's happening now that white people are listening to you more. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And so as a white person, I want to, one, be willing to talk about race, and two, if there are millions of people crying out and saying, I'm oppressed, my responsibility as a Christian is to hear them.
Yeah.
And the worst thing I can do is say, you're not actually oppressed. You're fine. That is terribly, terribly non-Christian. And so, anyway, so I don't know. I said a number of things.
Can I piggyback on that?
Yes.
I just want to add something to it because I think it's incumbent upon us too, as black leaders, as black pastors, to give the space for there to be a misunderstanding when there is a conversation. I don't believe that my dean is racist. I don't, by no stretch of the imagination, or even prejudice. I just thought in that moment he was just not sensitive to what I was, and I had to share with him in order for him to be knowledgeable, right? So there's got to be this openness,
Right.
as you said, grace for whatever conversations or thoughts or misunderstandings that may have happened, and for us to be gracious enough to be able to hear it. Reality, race is not new to the church.
Yeah.
Okay, it was a part of the first century church. If God does not give Peter a vision to go to Cornelius' house and give Cornelius a vision to receive Peter, there is no ministry. So when I was hearing your story about the two dreamers coming together, I was thinking Peter and Cornelius coming together at the place of a dream. God had to do that. If Paul is not opposing Peter to his face about how he's responding to Gentile brothers, there is an issue. If the Bible does not take very clear specificity to map out the cultures that were represented on the day of Pentecost, right? Then we're not having a conversation about race. It is a part of our Christian ethic, of our theological bedrock. So it should be a part of our conversation and how we move forward. So I just want to say thank you.
Yeah, totally.
I want to say thank you for at least lending your voice. And I'm not one of those that say, well, where were you? I'm just happy that you showed up.
Yeah.
Since Trey,
Right, yeah. I'm just so happy that you showed up. And I'm happy that you're able to have this conversation because I know that to certain people that may be in your congregation or even sometimes mine, it may be uncomfortable, but we've got to have it, and we're leading the conversation, not from a spirit of hate, not from a spirit of trying to say, oh, I got you.
Gotcha.
But from the standpoint of, let's understand, let's empathize, let's sit in this moment.
yeah, exactly.
Man, what if we could do that?
You
Just
know-
sit in the moment and lament.
How about that?
I want to say something that
you're good.
Chief Jimmy was saying. I caught how he was mentioning, I believe, diversity happening in the church and how some people were uncomfortable with that, how he was excited about it, but how some was uncomfortable with that. I think we, as leaders in the church, we've got to deal with that. Because here's the thing, you were mentioning how segregated the church is, and we are the most segregated institution on Sunday morning. Jesus, in Luke 15, he tells his parable about the what we call the prodigal son, or the wayward son. What I find interesting, some of my takeaway from this, is that the prodigal son, he comes back, and there's a great story of reconciliation. It's a wonderful story of reconciliation. And he comes back, and he takes himself out of the family because of what he's done. So he doesn't even feel worthy to be called his son. So he says, I'm going to go back to my father. I'm just going to say, at least accept me as one of the hired hands. But his father wouldn't even hear it. He wouldn't let him go there. See, here's the thing that I want to see happen. We talk about reconciliation, and this man, Wilford, I honor him, his stories, his ministry. I honor this man and what he has done with racial reconciliation. I just feel humbled to be on this platform with him. I'm not worthy, But here's the thing. In that parable, the father was like, no. I mean, he wasn't going to hear that you're not going to be a part of the family. You're part of the family. At the heart of reconciliation, I think also has to be the determination that we're going to be restored to one another. And what I mean by that is, I think people are happy with you being reconciled to God, but be restored to the family.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's different. Notice where the other brother is. He's outside of the house, and maybe we are comfortable with,
Dad's accepted you.
Dad accepting you as a black person and but coming to the house, I don't know if I want to come in that house. I'm out here, I'm kind of angry that Dad has done this. And so we're going to stay separate, although we're reconciled. You can be reconciled to God, but what about
good.
being reconciled to your brother? The part of the reconciliation I think we need to get to now is restoration.
Yes.
That we are restored to each other as a brother. That if I see you as my brother, I don't care about this. You are my brother. So if you're hurting, I am hurting. If we just say we're going to reconcile, we can reconcile and we go our separate ways.
Right.
And the church is okay. I was leading, I led worship at a church. I was the first black worship leader brought on this church of 50 years.
Sing the house.
Very first black.
Oh, yeah, he's a worship leader. Like,
And
worship leader.
here's the thing. As soon as I was hired on, there was a group in the church who asked a question of the senior pastor. We want to know one thing. Is this black man staying?
Wow.
These are born again, spirit-filled believers, but their question to the senior pastor
Filled with a spirit.
is this black man staying? Because if he is, we're leaving, and we're going to take our tithes with us.
Wow.
Now, it's a predominant white church, okay? Here's the pastor has a heart for diversity, so he hired me on. He knew that 90% of his congregation was white. The thing that broke my heart is just that before I got there, a couple of weeks before, you're lifting your hands and you're praising God and you're just, you know how great thou art. And I come and sing the exact same song.
Yeah.
How great thou art, but because my skin color is a little bit darker than yours, you can't enter in. You don't belong in this house. So the question is, if you're going to stay in the house, I'm going out of the house. It's the elder brother mentality that we're not addressing. That okay, yeah, he got reconciled to the Father. I didn't have anything to do with that, but I don't have to go in the house. I don't have to be with you. And I think this is what the Lord is trying to speak so loudly to us. We've got to come in the same house, man.
Pass the communion.
This can't be.
The sound guy,
And
get
we've
the
got- and we've
communion
got to
ready.
be
We gotta.
there
Yeah.
long enough for us to feel each other, know each other,
Exactly.
to empathize with each other, because it's I think it's time out for us just doing it for the look of it,
Right.
because it looks good, but coming to the place in which there is a deeper spiritual ethic of it that says that I no longer allow for those barriers to stand in the way of me loving you as my brothers.
Yeah.
Right? And there's got to be that level. And I believe God has a way of changing people's hearts to do that.
Yeah.
I am always godly optimistic. This is the hurtful part about all this is that I am very optimistic. God has created me to be optimistic, to be a faith guy like that. I'm just optimistic of people, all people. And then when I see it happen consistently, it's my optimism that's beaten up. But I still am optimistic that we can get to the place and get to the point where you can worship at that church. And it won't matter because people will hear the spirit of grace that's coming through you and be able to be reconciled with you. I've taught people this principle of Emmanuel, God with us, that when God says to Adam, where are you? It wasn't an issue of him trying to locate his physicality because God knows and sees all things. But I think that there was an element of what Adam was going through that God did not know because he had never been flesh. So he marched 42 generations down into the earth in the form of Jesus Christ to find out where Adam was. And so now we have not a high priest who cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmity because he wanted to be touched with our infirmity. If we as pastors, as leaders, as people, as Christians are not able to be touched with people's feelings,
Yeah.
then how can you lead people, or how can you be led by people that you don't have that particular element? That is the Emmanuel, God with us. That's what you were saying about being reconciled with each other.
And how can you love them
Yeah.
if you're not willing to identify with their pain? And we in the Christian circle, we say, oh, well, we love you, we love you. The truth is, do you really?
Yeah.
I mean, do
Feel
you
my pain.
really
Yeah.
love me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you love me past my hurt? Can I talk about these things and you still love me?
Uh-huh.
We have to go there. We have to be willing to love people past where they're hurting.
It reminds me of, I was thinking about Pentecost, past couple of weeks, and 120 in the upper room.
Yeah.
Jesus appears to 500 for 40 days after this, after he was resurrected, then he jets out. What happened to the 380, right? And so I was thinking about that, meditating on it, 380. And so I thought, 10 days quarantined, they didn't want to be quarantined after being quarantined for 3 or 4 months, right? It's like, I can understand, right? The fight over toilet paper, the fight in the upper room about just talking to each other. They were all different languages, right? So the OK sign in America is a whole lot different. It means a whole nother thing in Brazil, right?
right.
Yeah.
And so there's miscommunications going on, but something powerful happened. The Bible says that when the Holy Spirit fell for the first time, they understood one another.
Yeah.
I was praying about that, and the Lord said, stay in the room.
Yeah.
People are putting stuff out on Facebook, and we're not understanding each other.
Yeah.
We're miscommunicating and mixed messages or whatever. Stay in the room. Stay in the room when people are finally getting on the outside what's been happening on the inside. Job, that's how he got through his trial. He had 5 friends. They sat with him for not 7 minutes, 7 hours, 7 days.
Yes.
And then finally, when he thought he was in a safe place, he starts saying all this stuff about God and where were you and all this. It indicted the relationship that his friends had with God. And they said, Job, you did something. You didn't remember the whole
Yes.
thing. But Elihu stays in that room with him
Yes.
and connects him to wisdom, connects him to the God who shows up in the whirlwind. He gets everything back. I'm a black preacher, so he got double for his trouble.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Because they stayed in the room. That's what we got to do right now. We got to stay in the room with each other. We're going to make mistakes. Y'all going to make mistakes trying to understand the race issue. To say stuff that doesn't make sense. We can't. We need to be in a place where we're not judging that stuff right now. We need to be able to stay in the room, where y'all can hear our pain, our stories, hear your stories, hear your frustrations. But commit to staying in relationship, commit to staying at the table, commit to staying in the room.
That's right.
Yeah.
And if we do, we can see an epic outpouring.
You talked about the look of it, right? And one of the accusations for even having a conversation like this in a very conservative community is that we're just virtue signaling, right? Like we're not actually trying to solve anything, right? That's a common accusation for people who are sitting around and listening to the stories. And the accusation is this isn't statistics. These are emotional feeling sort of things that you guys are doing. You're not really addressing. How do we not do that? I mean, you even said it yourself. We are doing this for the show.
As a side note too, like that when people share those statistics to say it's all a lie, there are mountains of statistics that say it's all true.
Yeah, and then to the point.
It's like that Mark Twain. Sorry, I'm
No, you're good, you're
interrupting
good,
you
you're
like
good.
crazy. Y'all know that Mark Twain quote on lies and statistics? I'll clean it up for the Christian circle. There's 3 kinds of lies: lies, dang lies, and statistics. So anyway, okay, I'm not interrupting you. Go ahead.
I'm just to say that to credit that there are people who are fighting. I know the end part of your story is the guys that were there asking, it's tithe or him. He goes, oh, you're done. You're all excommunicated. Get out of here. You're not, he called you into the room, defended you. Yeah, I know. Come on. Yeah, there is more than virtue signaling happening.
Yes.
There are people who are standing up for truth. But that being said, how do we have these conversations and not just do that? Let's just have this conversation so that we look good, that we get a lot of views on our channel, that people think that we're real moral and helpful. How do we actually address this?
Well, for me, one of the things that I've always tried to push is not just the conversation, because I think we've been having conversations for years.
Yeah.
But then what's our mode of action after the conversation? And so I give for people specific things that they can do in the world. Everybody is not going to protest.
Right.
But if you're in a room and you're having a conversation, if you're a white person and you're in the room with other white people and you're having the conversation about it and something is said sideways concerning it, well, you can be an advocate in the room, in that room. If there are things that you can do as a police officer to help weed out all of the bad apples, right? You're an advocate in that room, right? If I'm in education and I'm teaching, that there are certain things that I can do and bring in resources. Even though the curriculum may not have it within itself, well, I'm a researcher. I can bring in resources and be an advocate in that room. So I think everybody has got to be an advocate in their room, whatever room that is. It could be politics, it could be business, it could be whatever. As pastors, we're an advocate for it, and that's the reason why so there is a conversation about, okay, so what are you going to do? We did this rally on yesterday with our young people because I've been teaching that there is power in your voice.
Yeah.
And they wanted to do their own rally in which they talked about things that were on their heart, and it was emotional and it was heart-wrenching, and tears were flowing. And then after that, we had some politicians that came and some police officers that came, and we gave them specific things that they can do in their room. See, so everybody has got something that they can do. So we just don't leave the table with a kumbaya moment
That's right.
and without something to do. And then maybe hold each other accountable for the things that we said that we were going to do. So kudos to that pastor that brought you into the room and dealt with it. That's an advocate in that room. So I think if we move for advocacy, what does that mean? What does that push look like? Better education on how police reform needs to happen. Maybe some kind of conversation with our police officers about what we can do to help you and to assist you, because you're absolutely right. I've did ride-alongs with police officers. I've counseled police officers. I know the psychological and emotional weight that they do carry. That's a real thing too. And so what can we do to bring about change and advocacy in our communities? So I think it's a moment of, yes, let's sit here enough so that we can understand each other and empathize with what's happening. Now, what can we do to change it? Almost systematically, but reality of it is that everybody is socialized to think a particular way.
Right.
Outside of that, what are some things that we can specifically do in our world to try and push the agenda forward towards racial reconciliation and racial understanding and empathy?
Amen. Why don't we just kind of work our way around, because I think it's time to maybe kind of close up with some final thoughts on answering this question of how we pursue justice and peace. And Patrick, I think you nailed it. You answered that. You almost look like you got something to add to it, do you?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add to it,
I'm a preacher.
come on. I wake up with stuff.
Like as if I did not come up with more.
I haven't blinked since I finished what I was saying.
Exactly. The Bible says, "The blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God." Peace is something that has got to be resonating on the inside of you in order for you to produce it outside of you. Peace doesn't happen without the process of turmoil. And we've got to be willing enough to deal with this tumultuous, uncomfortable storm. And in the midst of it, as men of God and as women of God that are probably watching, to be able to speak peace to it in a very specific and dynamic way. Jesus gave a parable of the Samaritan, the Good Samaritan, to speak peace to a particular situation. I think we've got to be able to do that. That's a part of that ethic of saying, I'm a peacemaker. I have a friend who is very militant, probably on the front line of every protest that you've probably seen on television. And one of the things that we were talking about, because he is a man of God, is it's very easy for his words to be misconstrued as bringing hate. And so he's got to be very careful in the words that he speaks now, so that he can bring peace. There is a responsibility that we have to make sure that we're doing that. And that's our kingdom ethic.
Amen. Amen.
I agree. What Patrick said earlier is so important of us keeping that communication in our space. Whatever we control, whatever impact that we have in the world that we impact. And again, as I mentioned earlier, policing is a national thing, but it's all local. All politics are local. All policing is local. At the end of the day, I have to control the world that I control. And so when those events happen within my confines of my world or within the people that I impact, I've got to be willing and able to step up and make this and say, no, that is not right. You're not going to say that. We're not going to allow that within this organization. Most officers that I know, particularly recently, are saying the very thing. They're saying, tell me what I am supposed to do. I want to do the right thing. Tell me the right, I want to make sure, and again, it's not just fairness, but it's about having that hard conversation of talking about, just having this conversation of saying, white folks think this and black folks think that. Just saying that sentence would not have been said a short time ago, because we'd all be going, oh, well, geez, I don't want to do that. So it's good that we're having this conversation, that we understand where everybody comes from. We understand what the bias that everybody brings to the table, and to be able to understand what everybody has and everybody offers, and to make sure that as those people who are charged legally with enforcing the laws, enforcing them fairly, treating everybody fairly, that we are doing those sort of things. Having this communication is the most critical thing that we can do, and I'm so grateful, because we've not had this conversation. I'm old enough, I've been around long enough to go through Rodney King, we talked about, and you go back, I can go back all the different ones, and it was a flash in the pan. It happened, and then it kind of went away, and everybody went back to their business. Okay, fine, yeah, you've had your say, and I can move on. This is different. This is fundamentally different, and in law enforcement, and the cops I talk to, we feel it. I know, and I hope from the black community, they feel it. I can tell you from the law, and not in a bad way, but there is going to be a fundamental shift in the way that we do policing in this country based on what is going on right now, and that's a good thing, because while there are tons and tons of really good cops that do really good work every day to try to keep their community safe, there are things that we need to do to fix to make it better, so it's fair for everybody, so that Floyd doesn't have to worry about it when he's that young man worrying about the officers coming up. He's not afraid of me standing here next to him. I dream of the day that black families do not have to have the talk. That is something that I don't want anybody to have to do that, because I don't want anybody to be afraid of what I represent and what I stand for and what I believe in. It just breaks my heart to think that we're that far apart still. But I'm in the fight, and I'm going to stay in the fight, and we're going to try to do what we can and move it forward. So,
Yes,
Thank
that's
you.
good. That's
Thank you.
very good.
Okay, Floyd, what do we do for justice and peace?
I'll just say this. I think we have to make sure that when we say justice, that from a kingdom perspective, that we understand justice doesn't mean revenge.
That's good, sir.
So many people think will say justice, in their mind, they want revenge. The Bible teaches us that the Lord says, vengeance is mine. So sometimes justice may not look the way you think it should look, but it doesn't mean it's not justice. We can influence, I think, what is happening in our society, and I think this conversation and what we're doing right now is tremendous. But we also have to remember that we're part of a kingdom culture. And so therefore, sometimes it means that even if I'm mistreated, Jesus says, if you're persecuted, he said that you're to bless and curse not. And so to me, I was having this conversation with someone the other day, and I was just saying to them, understand, what you're asking for is actually revenge and not justice. Mm-hmm. And they were like, well, I want someone to pay. Well, again, you understand that's what it is, you know. But I said, but you have to also understand, Jesus hung on a cross and said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. I said, the truth of the matter is, most people who hurt you and offend you, sometimes they have no clue.
No, that's right.
They have no clue of what they have done. And so I would just say to make sure that we always have a good biblical definition of what justice is, because it may not look like what we want. Mm-hmm. Yes, we need change. Mm-hmm. We're going to see change in our society, but I don't want people to get it confused. Revenge and justice, they're not the same.
That's good.
That's good.
That's good.
That's a great point.
That's good.
Mm. Okay. Chief, what you say?
Well, you know, I think, you know, when we accept that it's okay to say I don't know, you know, particularly like say in the law enforcement community, there's this secret veil that's been cloaked upon us that we've got to cure all of society's ills. And I think to a big degree, you know, there's a thing we should say about know your role. And you know, law enforcement, I mean, the nature of law enforcement is it's the arm of force for the state. So the state, the legislature creates a law. Law enforcement's job is to ensure that that law is complied with. And there's different levels of force, from I'm going to call the cops if you don't turn down your music, to take deadly force. And within that gamut of law enforcement's creation to make sure that the laws that the legislature have enacted are complied with, we've also become, you know, the counselors and marriage counselors, and dealing with civil custody issues, and so far beyond the pale and the scope of our initial creation that it puts a burden on law enforcement where we're operating well beyond our role, well beyond our capacity, well beyond our training. But at times it's okay to say, I don't know. And I say that with the law enforcement community as well as the white community, because it is. It's like, well, what do I do? Like, I want to do something, but I'm afraid. I don't want to look like I'm virtue signaling, or if I make a comment on, like, if you don't comment on Facebook, you're a racist. If you do comment on Facebook, where you been the last 50 years? So you're frozen in this state of, I don't know what to do. And I'll tell you, back at our home church, what we've really started doing, and God put it on my heart, called spiritual rebar. And you know, rebar is not pretty. Rebar is not the glass structure that comes above the surface. It's the foundational work that's being laid, that nobody sees, that nobody knows, everybody forgets about, but it's the strength, the foundation. So we've started working and being very purposeful and intentional in our communications. You know, you know, our church, our congregation is being encouraged. Look, reach out to somebody of a different race. Yeah, but what are they going to think? Just reach out. And I mean, I've learned, I mean, I know, but I've been reinforced. It's not my job to fix it when I talk to you. It's my job to listen. Just shut up and listen. And boy, you talk about empathy. How can I love you if I don't empathize? And so when we started laying the foundation of spiritual rebar, we begin to understand, you know, it's not the pretty steel structure. It's the foundational strength that's going to build upon where we're going in the future. So I believe that in the law enforcement community and in the white community, is that it's okay for us to just be honest. Like you said, show some grace. Like, look, man, I don't know, but I care. I want to know. And I'll just shut up and listen, because I want to be able to empathize with you so I can love you. And conversely, and I know, willing to let that oil flow. You know, if there's a receiving vessel, we know the reciprocation from the black community to be, well, I trust you. I believe you really want to know me, and I'm going to honor you with sharing my story. And I believe that's where we are, and that's where we need to be.
That's good. Amen. Yeah, that's so good. The spiritual rebar, that's so powerful. Part of that spiritual rebar too is forgiveness. For me, I had this dream about the dream of Dr. King. And I was actually going to do a reconciliation service at his old church, Dexter Avenue in Montgomery. And the night before, I had this dream where I'm going to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, but I couldn't get there until I first picked up Dr. King. So in the dream, he comes out of this house, and it's a dream, so he's alive, and he has this huge white duffel bag with black handles on it. And in the dream, he starts emptying all this dark garbage out of that duffel bag. And he comes to get into this vehicle with us. And in the dream, I thought, man, that bag would make a nice souvenir. I'm thinking, I went to Morehouse College, he went to Morehouse College. The bag would make a nice souvenir, which shows you how carnal I am in my dreams, right? But, so anyway, I go to try to pick up the baggage, but in the dream, Dr. King grabs me by my shoulders and he says, no, do not go back and pick that up. And he starts telling me what I need to do to heal the race issue in our nation. I woke up from the dream in tears. I didn't even realize I was weeping in intercession the whole night. I didn't even know it. Shared it with my friend. He begins to weep. We start praying, God, what does this dream mean? And the Lord said to me, waving the white bag with the black handles, that would be the interpretation for your dream. And I knew that the black handles represented how I, as a black man, had been handling my white baggage. God was saying to me, get rid of your white baggage. You've been carrying it for way too long. You know, so those other stories outside of the ones I told y'all today, I knew he was putting his finger on that. God was saying to me, get rid of your bitterness, get rid of your resentment, get rid of your guilt manipulation, get rid of your white baggage. And you know, the word accuser, for accuser of the brethren, is the word categoros. It's where we get the word category. And that's what I had done. In that region, I categorized every white person, every police officer. And so we got to forgive. Last thing I say is Jesus experienced racism. With the Samaritans, you don't cut through that Samaritan village. There's certain neighborhoods in Fort Worth I couldn't cut through. Right? Certain time when I couldn't cut through. Jesus couldn't cut through that Samaritan neighborhood. And so the disciples said, you want us to call down fire from heaven over this place? All the riots and all the... But Jesus, and it goes to the thing about revenge or justice, Jesus said, you don't know what spirit you're speaking from. The Son of Man didn't come to destroy man's life, but to save him. And sometimes we don't know what spirit we're speaking from. We think we want justice, but really we want revenge. You don't know what spirit you're speaking from. And I thought that was the end of him dealing with the Samaritans. But the next chapter gives 72 authority to cast out demons, sees Satan fall like lightning, so something shifted in the heavenlies. And then a man comes to him, a lawyer, and says, who's my neighbor? And Jesus says, let me tell you the story about a good Samaritan. It's like, hold up, Jesus, you just experienced racism from these Samaritans. Why would you be telling a story about a good Samaritan when you just experienced racism there? Jesus is doing this. He's released the proclamation of the gospel. He's shifted things, you know, on this realm and in the heavenly realm. And in that space with the heavens open, he says, I'm going to destigmatize the very people that the Jews can't stand. Wow. And I'm going to tell you a good story about a good police officer. I'm going to tell you a good story about a good black man. I'm going to tell you a good story about a good Samaritan. He chose that opportunity to do that. And that's what we need to do. The church needs to own this narrative and not negate the things that have happened. But we need to get these other stories out about a good police chief and a former good police chief who are willing to sit down, hear our stories, and move the chain forward.
That's good. Wow.
That's good.
Wow.
That's good.
I think, you know, I'll just kind of commend the people around the circle, I guess with my time, just because I've attended your churches. I've done ministry with you guys, and I've seen the way that you handle yourselves, and in particular with Pastor Floyd, when you talk about forgiveness, he shared one story of what a dozen stories he's got. Wow. And they're just as heart-wrenching. And he's got an 80-year-old woman named Mama Sharon who comes up and gives him a kiss on the cheek every single Sunday, you know, thanking him for being her pastor. And I do not think, and she's white. I'm so sorry, Mama Sharon is white, just to context this. I do not think we can achieve the unity necessary without forgiveness.
That's right.
Christ unified a people, forgiving them, and we can only unify a people through forgiveness. That is not placed on the black community for forgiving white people or police officers. There's so many white people walking around thinking that we have been accused. You've accused me of being racist. You've accused me of discriminating. And white people need to forgive and to move on so that we can accept this.
From that perspective, that's so good.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that a lot in the white community, there's a lot of defensiveness, like, stop putting white guilt on me, stop accusing me, I'm not going to feel bad because of the way God made me, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that we as the church, first of all, defensiveness should not be our posture. Like, how can we preach a gospel that says, you are a sinner saved by grace, and then go around and be like, I ain't no sinner. Like, or, you know, the heart is deceptively wicked above all things, Jeremiah 17:9, except I know my sin perfectly, and I don't have that. And so I think we're just like, we have such categories for racism that it's like, you're either the KKK or you're not racist in our mind. And I think as Christians, and I said this to my church a few weeks ago, I said the great commandment is not don't hate, it's love. Yeah. And the question I need to be asking myself is, to what degree am I going out of my way to show love? And once again, telling somebody else who's crying out to you in pain, you don't actually have pain because this statistic. Or you've just given into a media narrative. I mean, it's like Lecrae said last week. He said, I don't need the media to tell me how I'm feeling, to what I'm because this is my life story. So the first time I had a gun pointed at my head, I was age 13. Skipped school one day at age 14. They put me on a list of people in gang. My mom had to call and say, hey, he's not in a gang. This has nothing to do with it. And he said, this is my life story. I mean, this is like professional Christian rapper gets pulled over on his way to his own concert, gets all the seats taken out of his car, searched for drugs, and then he's left to put the seats back in. Jesus. That would never, ever, ever happen to me. I mean, I'm just being honest. It wouldn't. And so I just think that as white people, to speak to the white community, don't ask yourself, am I a hate-filled racist? Because it's easy to check that one off as no. Ask yourself, am I going out of my way to love? And I think one of the big things that we can do is go out of my way to listen. And this happened to me, you mentioned this with beginning in, was it 2014 for Trayvon Martin?
2012, 2013.
Yeah. So, because for me, I was looking at, okay, Obama's president, all the, the bad laws were changed, like we're doing okay. And then Trayvon Martin happens, and I'm like, what's going on? And Will was part of my church before he abandoned me. And
it's rough when Will Ford leaves your church. I hear that, though. That would hurt.
And I said, Will, help me understand. But
he called me after I left.
Yeah.
Which is, I just want to thank you, bro. Because listen, I told you back then, everybody has a blind spot when it comes to dealing with this issue. And you've never stopped learning.
Yeah, it's good.
Thank God for you, Michael.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, Will, he was the first one to take me by the hand. I've had some others since then, but Will was the first one to take me by the hand and to begin to open my eyes and show me. But I'm telling you, if I didn't try, this information wasn't going to fall in my lap.
That's right.
Nope.
So I went out of my way to learn, and I'm telling you, I've wept over this. My heart has broken over this. But if I'm just going to be defensive and turn this into a right and left political battle, I'm falling right into the media narrative. This is exactly what they want, right? My posture as a Christian cannot be defense first. It's got to be search my heart, O Lord. Yeah. And when I begin with that posture, then I can be a learner and a listener. And so that's what I would say, especially to the white community. Let's be learners and listeners, because when your heart starts to break for the broken, you can be part of the solution. And that's where justice flows out of. Because, as white people, we're like, hey, everybody just calm down, we'll have peace. But, and that's why the justice and peace are meant to go together. The deep level peace is what we're looking for. Not the peace of ignoring the problem, not the peace of sweeping it under a rug, but the peace of we have deeply heard each other and we feel deeply loved. And from that place, we can pursue justice. And again, to the white community, that's, it's like we're almost afraid of this word. Like, well, the gospel just transforms my heart. We don't need to worry about justice over here. But are we doing that with the pro-life movement?
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Like, we care about justice there. Well, why don't we care about justice here? And so I would say be listeners and learners. That's one of the most loving things that like if my wife doesn't feel loved, or it's largely because she doesn't feel listened to, she doesn't feel heard. When I give her a voice, she feels loved. And so that's what I would say is the kind of first step. Your heart begins to break for the problem, and then you can become part of a solution. I love what you said, in your area. For me as a pastor, it looks like one thing. For you as a pastor and an educator, it looks like a different thing. For you in law enforcement, it looks different. And so for all of us in our different avenues, it looks different. But But yeah, so that's what I would say. Go out of your way to be a listener.
That's great.
So, guys, this has been an outstanding conversation. I'm just going to take a moment and address our viewers. And thank you guys so much for tuning in. And I hope that you guys have benefited from this. If you have, please like it, comment, share it, because we believe this is a conversation that needs to go around the world, to go around this nation, and to be a baby step toward justice, a baby step toward peace. So if you could take a moment and do that, that'd be great. This isn't going to be the last one of these conversations. I hope you guys are willing to come back at some point in the not too distant future. But with that said, I'd love to just ask maybe Will, why don't you close us with a word of prayer?
That's good.
Jesus, we absolutely love you, God. Lord, in this place, Lord, where we are at the church, Lord, right now with all the pain that's being released, God, we thank you for listening ears. We thank you, Lord, for being in the midst of all that's going on. And God, we thank you that you're going to use a united church to heal a divided nation.
Amen.
You have a dream over this nation, God.
Yes, Lord.
And you're still leading us by this amazing dream that your son had in John 17. Father, I pray that they will be one.
Yes.
So that your glory could come, so that the world will believe. God, we ask you that you would keep us in this room.
Yes,
Keep us in this place where we are willing, people are willing to listen, and people are willing to share, and we're willing to grow in love with you and with each other. And God, we thank you that there's coming a baptism, the baptism of the love of God that's going to be so epic and so powerful. We're going to understand each other fully and understand you a whole lot more. We bless you. We love you. We thank you for this time. Bless every person that's listening to this conversation, and let the conversation continue. In Jesus' name, everybody said,
Amen.
Amen and amen.